My husband texted me, "Happy Valentine's" at 6:12 p.m., and at that exact moment, Elizabeth Carter was sitting 2 tables behind him watching him lean in and kiss another woman like their life together had never existed. The message lit up her phone with a soft vibration against the white tablecloth, the kind of small, ordinary sound that usually meant nothing, but tonight it landed differently, precise and timed, almost rehearsed. As if it belonged to a script she hadn't agreed to be part of, and for a second she just stared at the screen, at his name, at the casual warmth of those 2 words, before her eyes lifted slowly, deliberately. Across the dimly lit steakhouse, where couples leaned close over. Candlelight and low jazz drifted through the air, and that was when she saw him, Michael Carter, her husband of 18 years, seated in a corner booth beneath a soft amber light, his posture relaxed, his expression easy. His hand resting too naturally on the wrist of a woman Elizabeth had never seen before, a woman with a sleek blonde bob and a red wool coat draped beside her, someone who looked like she belonged exactly where she was, comfortable, confident, entirely unbothered by the fact that the man across from her was married, and Elizabeth didn't move, not at first, because the scene didn't feel real in the way shock is supposed to feel. There was no sharp break, no sudden rush of emotion, just a quiet, almost clinical stillness that settled inside her chest as if her mind had decided, instantly and without discussion, that this was something to be observed, not reacted to, and so she watched as Michael leaned a little closer, said something that made the woman smile, a small private smile that suggested familiarity, history, something practiced rather than accidental, and then the distance between them closed in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, no space for denial, just a slow, deliberate kiss that carried none of the hesitation of a mistake, and for a moment the rest of the restaurant seemed to fade, the clink of silverware, the low murmur of conversations, the soft hum of the HVAC system overhead, all of it dimming into the background as Elizabeth remained exactly where she was, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, because the truth was her heart didn't break in that moment. It didn't shatter or collapse the way people like to describe. It simply went quiet, completely and absolutely still, like a lake in late November just before the first snow. And that silence, more than anything else, was what kept her from standing up, from walking over, from demanding an explanation that would only come wrapped in lies, because somewhere beneath the surface of that stillness, something else had already begun to form, something sharper, clearer, a realization that what she was seeing was too clean, too composed to be spontaneous, that the timing of the message on her phone and the scene in front of her were not a coincidence, but a pattern. And Elizabeth Carter had always been good at recognizing patterns, even when she chose not to acknowledge them right away, and so instead of reacting, instead of making a scene that would give him exactly what he expected, she stayed in her seat, watching, listening, taking in every detail with a calm that didn't feel like strength yet, but wasn't weakness either, because the night wasn't unfolding the way it was supposed to, not for him, and he didn't know that yet. Elizabeth did not rush to speak again, and neither did the man beside her, because both of them understood something that did not need to be said out loud, that reacting too early would only close doors that had just quietly opened. So she kept her eyes on the table across the room while her mind began to move in a different direction, away from emotion and toward structure, toward sequence, toward the small inconsistencies that, when placed side by side, begin to form a pattern that cannot be ignored. And she thought about the last 3 months, about the late meetings that had become routine, about the sudden shifts in Michael's schedule that he explained with just enough detail to sound believable, but never enough to be verified, about the way he had started taking calls in another room, not secretive exactly, but separate, as if there was a part of his life that no longer required her presence, and at the time she had accepted it, not because she believed it completely but because nothing in his behavior had crossed a line that could not be explained, until now, because now she was watching him accept a folder from another woman with the kind of ease that comes from repetition, not from improvisation, and she noticed the way he handled it, careful but not cautious, practiced, as if he had done this before. And she noticed something else too, something smaller but sharper, the absence of hesitation, because people who are doing something wrong in public usually carry a trace of tension, a flicker of awareness, but Michael did not. He looked exactly like a man conducting business, and that detail settled heavily in her mind, because it suggested that whatever this was, it had already moved beyond secrecy into confidence, and confidence usually comes from preparation, and preparation means time. And time means planning, and she shifted her gaze slightly, just enough to see the reflection of their table in the darkened window beside her, because reflections reveal angles that direct sight does not, and in that reflection she saw Michael lean in again. Not to kiss this time, but to speak, his expression more serious now, focused, and the woman nodded once, then reached into her bag again and pulled out what looked like a second document, thinner, more precise, and placed it between them. And Elizabeth felt a quiet certainty settle in, not emotional, not reactive, just clear, that this was not an affair unfolding, it was an arrangement being executed, and beside her the man exhaled slowly and lifted his glass, taking a measured sip before setting it down with care, and he said, without looking at her, "I hired someone last week," and Elizabeth did not ask what he meant, because she already understood, and he continued, "I thought it was just suspicion. Something I could confirm and then decide what to do, but this," he gestured subtly toward the booth, "this is different," and Elizabeth nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because she was arriving at the same conclusion through a different path. And she finally spoke again, her voice even, controlled. "They're exchanging documents," she said, and he gave a small, humorless smile. "Yes," he replied, "and people do not exchange documents like that unless there is something at stake," and that word, stake, lingered in the space between them, because it implied risk, value, consequence, and Elizabeth's thoughts moved immediately to the areas of her life that involved all three: the house, the accounts, the business Michael had built over the years with her support, the investments, the properties, the quiet infrastructure of a shared life that most people never question until it begins to shift beneath them. And she realized then that the text message she had received earlier was not just careless, it was strategic, a way to establish normalcy, to create a record, to maintain an illusion that everything was as it should be, and that realization did not hurt. It clarified, because it told her something important about Michael, something she had not fully accepted until now, that he was not just betraying her emotionally, he was managing her perception, and that required intention, and intention can be traced. And traced things can be understood, and understood things can be used, and Elizabeth Carter had always been patient when something mattered, and this mattered. So instead of standing, instead of confronting him, instead of interrupting whatever he believed he was controlling, she remained exactly where she was, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture composed, her attention sharp, because the night was no longer about what he was doing, it was about what he thought he could hide. And more importantly, how long he had believed he could hide it. Elizabeth let the silence stretch a few seconds longer, not because she needed time to process, but because she understood the value of not interrupting a moment that was revealing itself so clearly. And across the room Michael closed his hand over the folder now tucked inside his jacket, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as if a decision had just been confirmed, while the woman across from him relaxed back into the booth with the ease of someone who had completed her part, and that small change, that subtle release of tension, told Elizabeth more than anything they had done so far, because it marked an endpoint, not a beginning, and endpoints always suggest that something had been building long before tonight. And beside her Daniel Brooks leaned slightly forward, his attention never leaving the table in front of them, and he said quietly, "Watch what happens next," and Elizabeth did, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as a waiter approached their table carrying a leather check presenter, placing it down with practiced politeness before stepping away, and neither Michael nor the woman reached for it immediately. Instead, they exchanged a few final words, brief, measured, almost procedural, And then Michael nodded once, a gesture that carried the weight of agreement rather than affection, and the woman mirrored it. And that was when Elizabeth noticed something else, something that did not belong to a romantic meeting. There was no lingering, no hesitation, no attempt to extend the time together, just efficiency. As if they both understood that staying longer would serve no purpose, and Michael reached into his wallet, placed a credit card inside the presenter, and slid it toward the edge of the table, and the woman gathered her coat without looking at him again, standing smoothly, adjusting the sleeve of her red wool coat with a small, precise movement, and for a brief moment she turned slightly, giving Elizabeth a clearer view of her face, composed, controlled, entirely untroubled, and then she walked away, her heels soft against the carpet, disappearing into the flow of the restaurant without a backward glance, and Michael remained seated for a few seconds longer, his eyes dropping briefly to the table, then lifting as he scanned the room once more, not searching, not worried, just confirming. And Elizabeth realized in that moment that he was not checking for her, because he did not expect her to be there, and that absence of expectation was not accidental. It was built on assumption, on a belief that she would be somewhere predictable, somewhere safe, somewhere outside the frame of whatever he was doing, and that belief, more than anything else, settled something firm inside her, because it meant he had already decided what she was capable of, what she would notice, what she would ignore. And people who make those kinds of decisions tend to miss the one variable they cannot control, and that is the moment when the person they underestimated stops behaving the way they expect. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his voice low. "She always leaves first," he said, almost to himself, and Elizabeth turned her head just enough to acknowledge him. "You have seen this before," she said, not as a question but as a statement, and he nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly, enough times to recognize the pattern. He replied, and Elizabeth looked back toward Michael, who was now standing, straightening his jacket, his movements unhurried, his expression composed, as if he had just finished a routine dinner, and the check presenter was gone, the table cleared, the scene reset, and for anyone else in the room, there was nothing unusual to notice, nothing to question, just another man leaving a restaurant on a winter evening. But Elizabeth saw it differently now. She saw the structure beneath the surface, the sequence of actions, the consistency of behavior, and more importantly, she saw the gap between what Michael believed was hidden and what had just been revealed, and she did not stand up to follow him. She did not reach for her phone. She did not signal to Daniel. She simply remained seated, her hands still, her posture calm, because moving too soon would turn observation into reaction. And she was not ready to give that up yet, not when the night had already shown her that this was not about a single moment, not about a single betrayal, but about something ongoing, something deliberate, something that extended beyond this restaurant, beyond this evening. And as Michael turned toward the exit, walking past rows of tables filled with quiet conversations and soft laughter, Elizabeth Carter made a decision that did not show on her face, did not change her expression, did not alter her breathing, but settled into place with the same quiet certainty that had been building all night. She was not going to confront him, not tonight, because whatever he thought he had just completed, whatever he believed was finished, was only the part he could see, and what he could not see yet was that someone had been sitting 2 tables behind him the entire time, watching, listening, and understanding far more than he intended. Elizabeth waited exactly 30 seconds after Michael disappeared through the restaurant doors before she moved, not because she was unsure, but because timing mattered. And leaving too quickly would feel reactive, while waiting just long enough would keep her in control of the moment. And when she finally reached for her coat, her movements were unhurried, precise. The same calm she had carried all evening now fully settled into something sharper, something intentional, and, beside her, Daniel watched without interrupting, as if he understood that whatever she was about to do next was no longer about shared observation, but about individual decisions. And she stood, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket, her eyes briefly scanning the room one last time, not for Michael, not for the woman, but for details, for anything she might have missed, because people often reveal more in the edges of a moment than in its center, and she noticed the empty booth where they had been sitting, already reset. The candle replaced, the surface wiped clean, as if nothing had happened there at all, and that struck her as almost symbolic, how quickly something significant could be erased from view, how easily a scene could be cleared once its purpose had been served, and she turned slightly toward Daniel, her voice low, controlled. "You said you hired someone," she said, and he nodded, his expression steady. "Private investigator," he replied, "licensed, discreet, thorough." And Elizabeth held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not assessing him personally, but measuring the reliability of what he represented, because trust was not something she extended easily, especially not in a moment like this. And yet the situation had already shifted beyond coincidence, beyond isolated betrayal, into something structured enough to require information, and information required sources, and sources required decisions, and she nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. "Keep watching," she said quietly, not as a request, but as a statement of direction, and Daniel gave a slight tilt of his head, understanding without needing clarification, and Elizabeth turned toward the exit, her heels soft against the carpet, her pace steady, neither hurried nor slow, just deliberate, and when she stepped outside, the night air met her with a sharp, clean cold that carried the faint scent of asphalt and distant exhaust. The kind of February evening where the temperature hovered just above freezing, around 35 degrees, and the parking lot lights cast long pale reflections across the rows of cars, and for a moment she simply stood there, her breath visible in the air, her hands relaxed at her sides, because this was the first moment all evening where she was no longer observing him but returning to herself, and she let that settle, not emotionally, not dramatically, just a quiet recalibration, and then she walked toward her car. A dark gray Lexus parked near the edge of the lot, and as she reached it, she paused again, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, because something else had begun to form, something that had not been fully clear inside the restaurant, but was now coming into focus, and it was not just about what Michael had done, it was about what he expected to happen next, because people who plan things like this do not leave the outcome to chance, they anticipate reactions. They prepare responses, they build contingencies, and that meant he already had an idea of how she would respond when the time came, whether that time was tomorrow, next week, or some carefully chosen moment in the future, and that assumption, that quiet confidence in predicting her behavior, was the one advantage he believed he had, and Elizabeth Carter did not like leaving advantages unchallenged, and she opened the car door, sliding into the driver's seat, the interior still holding a faint trace of leather, and the last drive she had taken earlier that day, and she did not start the engine immediately. Instead, she sat there, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her eyes unfocused for a second as she replayed the sequence again, the message, the timing, the exchange, the absence of hesitation, the structure of it all, and then she reached for her phone, not to call him, not to confront him, but to do something far simpler, far quieter. She opened their message thread and typed a response, her fingers moving steadily across the screen. "Happy Valentine's," she wrote back, nothing more. No questions, no emotion, no indication that anything had shifted, and she pressed send, watching as the message delivered, because sometimes the most effective move is not to disrupt the pattern, but to let it continue just long enough for it to reveal everything it was trying to hide. And then she started the engine, the low hum filling the quiet space around her, and pulled out of the parking lot with the same calm precision she had carried all night, because whatever Michael believed he had just secured inside that restaurant, whatever agreement he thought was safely out of reach, had already begun to move in a direction he did not control, and he would not realize that until much later. Elizabeth drove home without turning on the radio, the quiet inside the car more useful than any distraction, because silence had a way of letting details settle into place, and as the city lights passed in steady intervals across her windshield, she began to organize. what she had seen into something more structured, something that could be followed, tested, confirmed, and when she pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, the house looked exactly as it always did, still, familiar, unchanged. A two-story brick home with soft porch lighting and curtains drawn just enough to suggest routine rather than absence, and that contrast between what had happened and what appeared normal did not unsettle her. It clarified the separation between appearance and reality, and she stepped inside, setting her keys down in the same place she always did, removing her coat with the same unhurried motion, because maintaining routine was not denial, it was control, and control would matter now, and she moved through the kitchen. Filling a glass of water, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, and she did not rush to check her phone, but when she finally did, there it was, Michael's reply, delivered just minutes after hers. Hope you are having a relaxing night, it read, simple, consistent, aligned perfectly with the version of the evening he believed she was living, and Elizabeth allowed herself a small pause, not to react, but to register how easily he continued the narrative. How naturally he extended it without hesitation, because that meant the message she had sent had not disrupted anything, it had confirmed his assumption, and that was exactly what she needed, and she placed the phone face down on the counter, not responding again, because too much communication would introduce variables, and variables made patterns harder to read, and instead she walked upstairs, her steps quiet against the carpet, entering the bedroom where everything remained in place. The bed neatly made, the dresser organized, the small details of a shared life undisturbed, and she stood there for a moment, not looking for evidence, not searching for signs, but observing the space with a different awareness, because spaces hold habits, and habits reveal timelines, and timelines could be traced, and she opened the closet, her gaze moving across his suits, arranged in the same order they had always been, but something about them felt different now, not physically, but contextually. Because she knew now that at least some of those late meetings had not been what they seemed, and she closed the door again without touching anything, because this was not the stage for confrontation. Not yet, and she returned downstairs, taking a seat at the kitchen table, her laptop opening with a soft click, and this was where the shift became visible, not externally, but in intention, because instead of replaying the evening again, she began to map it. Starting with the simplest point, the time of the message, 6:12 in the evening, then the location, the restaurant, then the sequence, arrival, contact, exchange, departure, and she wrote it down in short, clear lines, not emotional, not interpretive, just factual, because facts do not change under pressure, and once they are laid out, they begin to show connections that are otherwise easy to miss, and as she typed, she added the previous months, the late nights, the calls, the travel. Each detail placed into the same framework, and slowly, something began to take shape, not a full picture yet, but enough of an outline to suggest direction, and she paused, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, because there was one piece she did not have yet, and that piece was intent, not what he was doing, but why, and that answer would not come from assumptions, it would come from evidence, and evidence required access, and access required patience. And Elizabeth Carter had already chosen that path, and as the clock on the wall moved past 10:30, she closed the laptop, not because she was finished, but because she understood the importance of stopping before pushing too far. Because clarity comes in layers, not all at once, and she stood, rinsed her glass, and turned off the kitchen light, leaving the house in the same quiet state it had been in when she arrived, because nothing outward had changed yet, nothing visible. Nothing that Michael would notice when he walked through the door later that night, and that was the point, because as far as he knew, everything was exactly as it should be, and that belief, that comfortable certainty, was the space she intended to let him stay in just a little longer. Because people reveal far more when they believe they are safe than when they feel threatened, and tonight had only been the first layer of something much larger, something that had been building quietly, just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen. Michael did not come home immediately that night, and Elizabeth noticed that not by watching the clock, but by the absence of familiar sounds. The garage door that usually rumbled open sometime before 11, the quiet click of the front door, the measured footsteps moving through the hallway, and when those sounds did not arrive, she did not question it, because it fit too neatly into the pattern she had already begun to trace, and she remained upstairs, the bedroom dim except for the soft light of a single lamp, a book open in her hands that she was not reading, her attention instead resting on the rhythm of the house. On the way, silence could reveal more than noise when you knew what to listen for, and at 11:43, she heard it, the low mechanical hum of the garage door lifting, followed by the pause that always came before it settled back into place, and then the front door opened, closed, and Michael Carter stepped inside the life he believed was unchanged, and Elizabeth did not move. She did not call out. She did not shift her posture. Because she understood that the first moments of return often carried the most unguarded behavior, and she listened as he moved through the kitchen, the faint sound of a cabinet opening, a glass being set down, water running briefly, all of it normal. All of it consistent with the version of the evening he had constructed, and then his footsteps came up the stairs, steady, unhurried, and when he entered the bedroom, she looked up, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge his presence. Her expression calm, her voice even. "You are home late," she said, and he gave a small, apologetic smile, the kind he had used many times before. "Practiced, reliable, long night," he replied, loosening his tie, setting his phone on the dresser without hesitation, without concern, because in his mind there was nothing on it she had not already accepted. And that detail, the casual placement of the phone, did not go unnoticed, because people who are hiding something tend to control access, but Michael did not. Which meant he believed the boundaries were already established, and Elizabeth closed her book, placing it beside her. "I hope everything went well," she said, her tone neutral, offering him the opportunity to define the narrative, and he nodded. Moving toward the closet, "It did," he answered, simple, contained, no elaboration, and she watched him for a second longer, not searching for signs of guilt, but observing the consistency of his behavior, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the absence of any shift that might suggest discomfort. And it confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that whatever he was doing had been normalized in his mind, integrated into his routine to the point where it no longer required adjustment. And that kind of integration does not happen quickly. It develops over time, through repetition, through reinforcement, through the quiet confidence that comes from not being challenged. And Elizabeth turned off the lamp, the room settling into darkness. And they moved through the rest of the evening with the same quiet familiarity that had defined their life for years. No arguments, no tension, just the steady rhythm of two people sharing a space, and if anyone had looked in from the outside, they would have seen nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the shift that had already taken place beneath the surface, and that was exactly how Elizabeth intended it to remain, because disruption at this stage would serve no purpose. It would only alert him, force adjustments, close off access to whatever he was trying to protect. And she was not ready for that yet, and as she lay there, her breathing even, her eyes closed, she listened to the subtle changes in his breathing beside her, the way it slowed, deepened, settled into sleep, and she waited, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because timing mattered, and when she was certain, she opened her eyes again, turning her head slightly toward the dresser where his phone rested exactly where he had left it, unguarded, within reach. And she did not move immediately, because this was not about impulse, this was about sequence, about choosing the right moment to take the next step without breaking the pattern he believed was intact. And as the minutes passed, Elizabeth Carter understood something with complete clarity. Tonight had not been about discovering the truth, it had been about confirming that the truth existed, and now that it did, the next phase would not be about watching, it would be about access, and access, once gained, would change everything. Elizabeth did not rush the moment, and she did not let curiosity override discipline, because she understood that access gained too quickly is often access lost just as fast, so she waited, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, allowing the quiet of the room to settle fully, until the rhythm of Michael's sleep became consistent, deep, predictable, and only then did she move, slowly, carefully, her hand sliding across the space between them with the kind of precision that comes from intention rather than hesitation, and she reached the edge of the dresser, her fingers closing lightly around his phone, lifting it without sound, without disruption, and she returned to her side of the bed, the screen dark in her hand, her thumb hovering for just a second before she activated it, and the screen lit up, soft and controlled, and what she saw first was not resistance, but ease. Because the phone was not locked in a way that excluded her, the passcode something she already knew, something that had never been hidden, and that detail alone confirmed again what she had already suspected, that Michael did not believe he needed to protect this space from her, because in his mind the boundaries were already defined, and she entered the code, the device opening without delay, revealing a screen that looked exactly as it always had, familiar, ordinary, unchanged. And that was where most people would stop, reassured by the absence of obvious evidence. But Elizabeth did not stop there, because she was not looking for what was visible, she was looking for what had been structured to remain unnoticed, and she moved through the device with quiet efficiency, not scrolling randomly, not reacting, but following a sequence, messages first, then call logs, then calendar entries, each step deliberate, each action controlled. And the message thread between them sat exactly where it always had, consistent, polite, unremarkable, her response from earlier visible, his reply beneath it, and nothing in that thread suggested anything beyond routine, and that was expected. Because people who manage perception do not make mistakes in the most obvious places, and she moved on, opening his recent calls, scanning the numbers, the durations, the times, and there it was, a number that appeared more frequently than the others, not labeled, not saved. Just a string of digits repeating across different days, different times, and she did not call it, she did not save it, she simply noted it, committing it to memory before moving forward, and then she opened the calendar, and that was where the pattern began to show more clearly, because the entries were structured, labeled as meetings, consultations, site visits, all the language of legitimate work. But the timing aligned too closely with what she had already mapped earlier that evening, the late nights, the sudden changes, the gaps that had once seemed explainable but now formed a consistent pattern when viewed together, and she scrolled back further, weeks, then months, her movements slow, precise, and the repetition held, steady, deliberate, too consistent to be accidental, and she paused, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood that information without context is only partial, and she needed more than confirmation. She needed connection, and she exited the calendar, returning to the main screen, her eyes moving across the apps, the familiar layout, the expected arrangement, and then she saw it, not hidden exactly, but placed in a way that made it easy to overlook, a secondary email account, one she did not recognize, one that had not been part of their shared routines, and that detail shifted something slightly, not dramatically, just enough to indicate that this extended beyond scheduling, beyond communication, into something more contained, more controlled, and she opened it, her movements still measured, still quiet, and the inbox loaded slowly, a handful of messages appearing, not many, but enough, and she did not read them all, not yet. She scanned the subject lines first, looking for structure, for repetition, for language that suggested purpose, and one stood out, recent, concise, with an attachment, and she opened it, the document loading onto the screen. Lines of text forming something formal, something legal, something that did not belong to a casual exchange, and Elizabeth Carter felt that same clarity settle deeper, not emotional, not reactive, just precise, because this was no longer about suspicion. It was about Evidence, and evidence changes the nature of everything, and she did not continue scrolling. She did not rush to gather more, because she understood the importance of restraint, of leaving the environment exactly as it was found. And she closed the document, exited the account, returned the phone to its place on the dresser with the same quiet care she had used to take it, and lay back down, her eyes closing again, her breathing steady, because the night had already given her what she needed. Not the full picture, not yet, but enough to confirm that what Michael believed was contained was already beginning to open, and he was still sleeping beside her, unaware that the structure he had built so carefully had just revealed its first real weakness. Elizabeth did not sleep much that night, not because her mind was racing, but because it had already settled into a kind of quiet focus that did not require rest, and when morning came, it arrived the way it always did, pale light slipping through the curtains, the soft hum of the house returning as systems woke up one by one, and beside her Michael stirred, stretching slightly, his movements unremarkable, routine, and for a moment she watched him the same way she had watched everything else. The night before, not emotionally, not reactively, but analytically, because now she understood that the version of him she had known was only part of a larger structure, and structures reveal themselves through repetition, and repetition leaves traces. And traces can be followed, and she sat up slowly, reaching for her phone, not to check messages, not to react, but to continue the sequence she had already begun, and Michael moved through his morning as he always did, shower, coffee, brief conversation that stayed comfortably on the surface, and when he left, the house returned to stillness, and that was when Elizabeth opened her laptop again, pulling up the notes she had started the night before, the timeline now clearer, more detailed, anchored by what she had seen and what she had accessed, and she added to it the secondary email, the recurring number, the document that had appeared only briefly on his screen, but long enough to establish its nature, legal, structured, intentional, and she did not need to read every line to understand its purpose, because context had already done most of the work, and she leaned back slightly, her fingers resting against the edge of the table. Because now the question was no longer whether something was happening, but how far it extended, and more importantly, how it would be used, and her mind moved to the one variable she had not yet fully integrated, Daniel Brooks, the man in the restaurant. The one who had already taken steps she had not, and she reached for her phone, scrolling through her recent calls, the number he had given her the night before still unsaved, still unfamiliar, and she pressed it, holding the phone to her ear as it rang, once, twice, before he answered, his voice steady, as if he had been expecting it. "I was wondering when you would call," he said. And Elizabeth did not respond to the tone, only to the content. "You said you hired someone," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, and there was a brief pause on the other end. Not hesitation, but calculation. "I did," he confirmed, "and I have more than I had last night," and that was enough. Not a full answer, but a direction, and Elizabeth stood, moving toward the window, looking out over the quiet street as she listened, and Daniel continued, outlining what he had learned, not in detail. Not yet, but enough to establish scope. Meetings that were not just personal but financial, documents tied to assets, accounts that had been shifted quietly over time, and Elizabeth felt that same clarity deepen. Not shock, not anger, just confirmation, because this was not impulsive, it was strategic, and strategy leaves patterns that can be reversed if you understand them well enough. And she spoke again, her tone unchanged. "I want access to everything you have," she said. And Daniel did not object, did not question, because the situation had already aligned their interests in a way that did not require negotiation, and he agreed, setting a time, a place, later that afternoon, and when the call ended, Elizabeth remained by the window for a moment longer, her reflection faint in the glass, and she studied it not as an image, but as a position, because the woman standing there was no longer reacting to a betrayal. She was preparing for something else entirely. Something that required precision, patience, and control, and she turned back to the table, closing her laptop, gathering her things with the same quiet efficiency she had carried through every step so far, because whatever Michael believed he had secured, whatever outcome he was preparing for, had already begun to shift the moment she chose not to react, and as she stepped out of the house, locking the door behind her, the morning air cool and steady, Elizabeth Carter understood one thing with complete certainty. The night before had not been the moment everything fell apart, it had been the moment everything became visible, and visibility changes power, and once power shifts, outcomes rarely unfold the way they were originally planned.